Today we are interviewing Mr. Charles Gay, born in 1923, World War II and Korean veteran. Became a captain, 35 missions, the 8th Air Force.
Yeah.
And Charlie and I are both members of the American Legion, Post 199, Fairhope, Alabama. Charlie, tell us about your early years, your childhood, and your family.
Well, I was born in Montgomery, but I lived there probably till I was 5, 6 years old. My father bought a house in Fairhope, Alabama in 1928 for the purpose of conducting some speed trials on a speedboat that he had built in Montgomery. It was a Garwood speedboat with two 12-cylinder Liberty airplane engines in it, which when he tried to go 100 miles an hour in Mobile Bay, the whole boat disintegrated, and there are two 12-cylinder Liberty airplane engines, as any Shumper will tell you, somewhere in Mobile Bay that they hang on to this very day.
Interesting.
Well, that's how I came to the area, but the little house was on the corner of Summit and Magnolia. We still had a home in Montgomery. The little house got to be sort of a hangout for whichever of I had 3 older sisters, and whichever one of them was presently divorced, single, or otherwise, they were to live in a little house. Well, but I grew up in Tampa, Florida, of all things. My father worked for the Mountain City Mills, which owned the Chattanooga Bakery and is now famous for moon pies, the Chattanooga Bakery.
Yes, sir.
But in 1932, a moon pie was 8 inches in diameter, had more chocolate, and it cost a nickel. And he couldn't sell it, but he tried. But I went to high school in Tampa. Tampa, Florida had a population of about 125,000 people in the 30s, the depths of the Depression. The only thing that happened in Tampa was that we just had illegal Cubans who rotated between Havana and Tampa, roll cigars for a week, get to pay and go back to Havana, and another bunch of illegal Cubans would come and roll the cigars. And Tampa had at least a dozen Havatampas, Tampa Nuggets. It was a Garcia and Vegas was one of them. But I was heavy in the scouting movement in Tampa, and I graduated, well, no, I didn't graduate, but I was in the class of 1941 at Plant High School. But at that time, my father had become a Packard dealer in Clearwater, Florida, and Mr. Packard closed up his shop or going in the process of closing up and building Packard Rolls-Royce airplane engines on account of the war. So Pappy moves to Montgomery, and I got 2 months of school, and I wasted a whole year and almost 1942 taking one course in trigonometry at Lanier High School, which I actually graduated in 42, but I had a number of courses at the Auburn Extension, which they had there. They call it continuing education now, but it was at Extension. It was largely done by correspondence, etc. And I was a student at Auburn at the time that they had an advertisement for be a Army Air Corps cadet, and we want intelligent flying officers, so you'll be deferred till you graduate if you'll just join the cadets now. Well, I joined the cadets on December the 5th in 1942, and on December the 6th, I was in the service. That's shortest deferment in history.
Yeah, I believe it is.
But went to basic training, of all places, in Miami Beach. The the Miami Beach hotels, and this is in 1942. Pearl Harbor was a year, almost to the day after Pearl Harbor, and the resort hotels in Miami Beach were empty. The war had been going on a year. So somebody got the bright idea of having Air Force basic training, which Army Air Corps basic training, which is the same as the infantry. Rifles, grenades, everything, and 8 hours of close order drill every day. I had been in the ROTC for 3 years, so it was, after about 3 weeks, they decided we already had basic training. So off we go to a new program they called aviation students, where the kids that had just been out of high school or didn't even have a high school diploma went to these small colleges. In my case, I went to Capital University, which was a Lutheran girls' school that had no facilities for men, but we, as an aviation student, to learn algebra, high school trig, English composition, and literature. Well, I already had it. But while we were at and this is in Columbus, Ohio, which the other little school was called Ohio State. They'd never let you forget it. But they did get 8 hours of flight time in these little Piper Cubs. They weighed 700 pounds. They had 2 seats, one in the front and one in the back. And the little airplane had a 65 horsepower engine, but it flew. The first thing that they did to teach you how to fly was to take all your hands and let you see that that little Piper Cub could fly better than you could, and it was just an airplane, you know. But we enjoyed it. However, I had already had about 6 or 7 hours in Piper Cubs in Bonifay, Florida, with an old fishing buddy of mine named Hillary, I forget Hillary. Anyway, we used to fly out of Bonifay with a Gulf road map, and you charge you a nickel for deposit. This is back in the 30s, a nickel deposit on a Coca-Cola bottle, and his mother owned the Bonifay Hotel, and we would go at the back of the hotel, take the Coke bottles, cash them in for a nickel, and buy a gallon of gasoline and put it in the little Piper Cub. Off we go. And that's where I learned to fly.
What an adventure.
I didn't know how to land, but I knew. But I learned how to navigate because Hillary could get lost on the way to the men's room, you know. So we made a great team. But nonetheless, the Air Force fiddle-faddled around about 2 months with a bunch of guys that were already mostly, you know, first quarter sophomores, juniors, college kids. Well, we wound up pre-flight back in Montgomery, Alabama, except by way of Nashville, Tennessee, where you are then an aviation cadet earning $75 a month, whereas an aviation student, your rank is really PVT, and the pay at the time was $27 a month, or maybe 21, I forget which, but all it was cigarette and soap money because your needs were cared for. The classification center, all these college kids go to Nashville, Tennessee, and decide whether you're going to be a pilot or a navigator, or whether you're going to be a bomb aimer, such as RF called them, bombardier. And most everybody wanted to be a pilot. And you had all sorts of tests, these psychomotor tests that have a little steel rod that you held at arm's length that had in a little hole about 1/4 of an inch square. It was electrified, and when you touched the corner of that little hole, it would go bang. It'd make this huge noise. So that you wanted to see how steady your nerves were. Oh. And the thing was go bang, 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 bang. You feel, oh, God, I'm terrible. I'm a goner. If you don't pass your psychomotor test, you don't even go in the cadets, you're back in the infantry. That's the advantage of being in the Army Air Force. You didn't take long to be a, we call them paddlefoots, but back in the gravel agitation. So anyway, the next step from being classified as a pilot is to go to pre-flight back at Maxwell Air Force Base, which is a permanent base even today, and it incidentally has every record of every mission that anybody ever flew in the 8th Air Force on microfilm. And if you have anybody that is questions, I have several friends that had their feathers clipped by claiming to be anything from colonels and major generals to the fact that they were PFCs in the oil changing business. But these personnel records at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, now you have to have your name, rank, and serial number. You don't know, those are not public records, but my tail gunner, back to Raymond Hill, went and made a documentary, amateur, complete with video, and his wife, whose name's Dora Jean, who was a 1976 school teacher of the year, and he made a documentary, and he went into those Maxwell Air Force records, which, and this was in the summer of 1948, fall, part of the winter, and there's Raymond, you know. Well, he didn't mention the part, nothing in his record about him getting shook out of the tail of the B-17 and landing in France, because he wasn't captured, he wasn't a POW, he didn't evade anybody. He finally, somebody got him a ride back to England, and I don't think he even missed a mission. But we called him Boomerang for a long time. But Raymond, this document, I have a copy of it if you'd like to have it. It's about 1.5 inches thick, and in it, oddly enough, Raymond is, he had just a few missions to go, but the airplane that led the 8th Air Force, which was in the late 44s, was usually put up 800 to 1,000 airplanes. They didn't all go to the same target, but they were, and another 400 or 500 fighters to escort. But Raymond, he said, you know, said the only time he didn't get to fly tail gunner, said this guy that was in the Air Force lead, they have to have a commissioned pilot officer to fly the tail gun, because he's the only person that can see all the way backwards, that looks at the whole 8th Air Force and tells the generally a full colonel and sometimes a brigadier general what's going on, you know. And he said he found out in that particular mission, he did get on board as a waist gunner, but he found out that the tail gunner was a guy named Charlie Gay, which was his co-pilot back in the first of the war, you know. So anyway, I did. I flew one mission as a tail gunner.
That must have been an interesting experience.
Well, except that there's a full bird colonel who was very foul-mouthed, and he had a light colonel for his co-pilot, and everybody on the airplane was a bombardier, was at least a major. And anyway, he was very profane, and he kept saying, you know, what in the blankety blank is those idiots doing now? I said, who is where? And I said, well, the next group, and I had no idea, said they're Essen, but they're 2 miles back, and they're Essen south or east, and they're following is Essen with them because they're killing time. Everything was done in units of 15 seconds. You had, if you ever saw that movie about 12 o'clock high, this guy, navigator, lost 2 minutes, couldn't make it up, killed himself, which is just exactly, but they didn't work at 2 minutes. 30 seconds was, if you did not make the initial bombing point at your required 30-second interval, you had to circle till you could find a hole to do so. It was very, very precise kind of work, except when it was cloudy and then they was bombed Germany, you know, overcast. In the fall of 1944, they had developed a process for radar bombing where they took the ball turret out of a B-17 and put a plastic dome in one airplane for each group. And the other 35 followed that airplane. And when he ascertained that they were over the target, which was always a city and usually a railroad marshaling yard, because that's just all the radar could see, and usually they had to have a river to check out, and maybe an Autobahn. The Autobahns would show up on radar, but everything else was a bunch of fuzz. I looked at the screen one time and it looks kind of like my MRI on my back, you know. It doesn't make any sense at all, but they'd unload these bombs right in the middle of the clouds, and that's what is, many people that don't know about it, they call terror bombing, which was just, if a few bombs got the civilians all the more better, because our normal targets in daylight precision bombing were targets like the second powerhouse and a cannon factory, I mean in Essen or something like that, or the percolator or the number 2 percolator for the synthetic oil and plant, which in 1944 was our principal targets, were synthetic oil, because the Germans did not have a ready source other than the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, of which the 9th Air Force paid daily attention to. So the Germans were much smarter than we are today. They made aviation grade gasoline at a premium of nearly 25 cents a gallon out of bituminous coal. And they had plenty of coal, and they had plenty of gasoline, and they had plenty of places to make it, but that was our job, is to tear up all the synthetic oil plants. And the one that was the worst oil plant was outside of Leipzig, Germany, which was about 700 miles from England, an all-day trip. But the little town was called Merseburg, and we went there 5 or 6 times, and I think, I don't remember, except that the worst mission I have ever been on in my life, this general decreed that we weren't getting enough accuracy at around 30,000 feet. But mainly because we knew about the jet stream. And that part of Germany, almost always, there was 100 to 125 mile an hour tailwind. Well, a B-17 at 30,000 feet is going 250 miles an hour over the ground, meaning that the bombardier has got to start about a minute and a half on his rate computations. So the Norden bomb sight was a computer, but it was gyroscopic, not electronic. But at 100, we had air speeds of, ground speeds of as much as 375 miles an hour, and I try to hit a pickle barrel at 30,000 feet going at 375 miles an hour.
That'd be tough.
Well, we didn't mind because you didn't stay in the flight very long, but because those synthetic oil plants, you could count on 400 or 500 guns. Some of them, they rumor 1,200 at Merseburg. But this general decreed, by Jove, what we'll do, we'll go upstream. We'll bomb from east to west, so we'll go into the jet stream and we'll subtract that 120 miles an hour, and we'll subtract that from 250, so we're really, our ground speed is 130 miles an hour, and bombing accuracy will be extremely important. Not to mention the flight gunners, who they were tickled to death, but we lost 69 B-17s out of less than 700 flying upstream because it was taking so long to get, you know, to your target, that it was just we counted. Raymond Hill, he's bad about counting flag holes, counted 200 holes in the airplane, just in the bottom. He didn't count where it came out. But, well, luckily we did not lose an engine, nor was, well, yes, Bombardier John Collins got hit in the chest with a shell fragment, knocked off of his sight, but happily he was wearing a flight vest. You know, we looked like a Darth Vader because we had these steel helmets with these earphones and oxygen mask and these big fish-eyed goggles that were polarized, and then you wore a steel vest that went down over your privates, but you sat on a 1/4-inch steel plate because that was the most delicate part, because the flight came up, you know, more than so you sat on this steel plate.
Oh.
But anyway, this particular mission of sailing upstream and the losses, the whole 8th Air Force was, the ones that got home, in which most of them did, they were so badly beat up, it took them to as long. Our first plane took a week to even get it back to where it could fly again, you know, just, you had no brakes, no cowl flaps, but nobody except the bombardier was hurt, but he had a big bruise about as big as a pancake right in the middle of his sternum, but he knocked him out. And the navigator, when he was calling on the intercom, he says, you know, Callis is dead. Said, I can't make any sense out of him. Somebody said, well, look at his oxygen regulator. If it's blinking, you know, the only way you could tell you are dead or alive that when you breathe, your oxygen goes blip, blip, blip. Sometimes it goes blip, 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 blip. But anyhow, that's the way you told whether anybody was dead or alive, was the oxygen, because you know, once in a while you just get, your oxygen mask took about 60 seconds, maybe 50 seconds to pass out from, even with unlimited oxygen supply, you know, oxygen, anoxia. And anyway, it was sort of a typical kind of day at the office. There is only one mission out of 35, and I flew my first mission somewhere in July of 44, and the last one on New Year's Day of 45, which was the only day that we ever had a major engagement with the Luftwaffe. On my last mission, we had a 40-minute running gunfight with about 50 Messerschmitts and a couple of 109s and a few 110s, because we were leading the 8th Air Force, the 366th Bombardment Squadron, had 5,000 pounds of chaff, which is an aluminum foil, a little strip of paper, just has tissue paper on one side and aluminum foil on the other, and it's almost weightless, but it's called chaff, and they used it to drop. Each plane would carry a bundle of chaff to drop out of the radio operator would drop it, because the Germans found out they were much better at, even in visual conditions, with visual gun sights, that German radar was in such excellent condition that they would point these whole batteries electronically by radar, and they could fire 4 guns at the time much more accurately by radar than they could by looking through the gun sights.
Oh.
Incidentally, my lady, in those synthetic oil plants with hundreds of 88mm anti-aircraft guns in place, they didn't have the manpower to shoot them. They had plenty of ammunition. The ladies loaded those anti-aircraft guns because as they fired, they'd go into what they call battery, and it started back up. The shell would come out, and the lady, which had to weigh about 150 or 200 pounds, would pick one of these 70-pound shells up, stick it in the cannon before it goes back into battery. I mean, she has about a count of 2 to put this shell in the carrier to go back into battery to pull the trigger. But they can load them fast as they can, because they only shoot them about 6 or 7 times a minute, because the barrels gets hot, and
they heat up. If
they shoot too fast, they'll just wear the barrel out. But we did not know that until after, in Salt Lake City in 1990, anyway, they had this film about the Deutsche Frau that loaded the guns that killed the Dom Yankees, you know. They call us Luftgangsters. Yeah, you know, Luftwaffe and the Germans, they call us gangsters because they kill women and children, which is the reason I tell everybody my back it hurts. That, you know, God's just punishing me for killing all those women and children, but they only did it when it was cloudy, you know, in the days, and less than, I can't think of 10 times that we didn't have visual bombing because we just didn't go, you know.
Sure.
But the only time that I ever went over Germany and without any opposition was at a supposedly synthetic oil installation. Now, it wasn't a plant, it was installation, but it's probably storage tanks in Hamburg, Germany, on the Elbe River. But by 1944, Hamburg, Germany, you know, it had a firestorm that was started by the Luftwaffe. We were just stirring the ashes, except that they had these particular targets. But this day, it was in late November, December of 44. It was just solid overcast, so we're going to bomb the oil installation in Hamburg. Guess what? We didn't have one burst of flak, not one German fighter, not nothing. And I don't think we even found Hamburg, because if we had, except I think the Germans were smart enough, if they don't shoot, we don't know where it got Hamburg ever hit.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. One more story, and then I'll ask a question. I could go on forever.
This is very, very interesting.
On my 21st birthday, we were bombing a synthetic oil plant, and if it wasn't Leipzig, it was somewhere else. And we took a flak hit on a lubricating oil tank that they had on a firewall on 4 engines on a B-17, but the radial engines are round and they don't have like a car. You don't put oil in a pan to use. You use the oil, and it just blows out the back of the engine. You have to have 50 gallons to run it for 12 hours. Anyway, this oil shell fragment punctured this oil tank, which we found out later, but the oil runs down the bottom of this engine nacelle right out through a white hot turbo supercharger, which we had back even in 1944. It was turned even when that temperature was 63 degrees below zero Fahrenheit centigrade. Those radial engines were air cooled, and the temperature, that cylinder head temperature, never got any cooler than about 300 degrees, and the red line was 310. I mean, I did, pilots, in addition to flying formation. Who wasn't flying formation was keeping those 4 engines cool. But on my 21st birthday, this ball turret gunner, his name is Frank Brazier, talked to him the day after Christmas this year. He's 86, I think, younger. Was a gunner in the little ball that was on the bottom of a B-17. And I heard him on the intercom. He says, good gracious, fellas, we're on fire. Only it's a little stronger than that. He says, it's number 3, and he said, you better do something quick. He says, I'm out of here, you know. Well, you can't bail out until the pilot pushes a button, and there's a big gong in the engine room. You can hear it because it's very low frequency. It goes bong, 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 bong. But they'll test it on the ground every mission. Say, now guys, listen to this, and if you hear it, snap on your parachute and jump. Don't ask any questions. Just get out of here. But anyway, Raymond didn't hear the gong or anything. I turned to this guy. I said, you know, and of course, I'm pretty busy. The number 3 engine's right there. I was flying co-pilot, which is I always did, and I'll tell you about that if you're interested, because I was a checked-out pilot after 15 missions, but I always flew. But I digress. I turned to this guy, and I was turning off fuel boost, trying to feather the engine, trying to select the proper fire extinguisher mode and whatnot. At the same time, I told him and said, you know, it happened to be October the 8th in 1944. I said, this is my 21st birthday, and do you know, I think I've lived to be 21 years and 15 minutes old because this bird is just about to blow. But guess what? When you feathered it, the minute the engine feathered and turned off the fuel boost, the oil just kept running out of but the turbo supercharger didn't have anything to get hot about. And it was just like a welding torch when the engine was running, because it burned up the whole side of the tail and all the flaps, and was in the process of burning off a 2-inch gasoline tank that had 400 gallons of 100 octane gas, which is why those B-17s just blew up, just boom.
Oh.
You go. If it got to the gasoline, they didn't make a flame. It just went boom, and it just blew up. But anyway, of course, we're out of formation, you know, that sort of thing. But I happen to think that was I'm 87 and a half. I've had, during these 70 years of, you know, pretty good time, you know.
Oh,
you know,
it's incredible.
I was typical, and bear in mind that in 1944, the 8th Air Force, those are what we call the easy days. They lost more airplanes than they ever lost in 43 or 42, but they also were able to mount or put up 700,000 or 800,000 airplanes, you know. So the amount of damage, if you lost even 60, that's a 6% loss. Now that's 600 guys. I mean, if you think
sure.
in terms of loss of life, but the big brass thinks in terms of we only had a 6% loss, and lots of time it's only 2 or 3%. You know. Well, those losses were living, breathing people at one time. But that's statistically, everybody knows that. But anyway, one more question. I spent my career as a co-pilot on a very, very worthwhile crew. This California guy named Callis was sleepy, and I think he was doing drugs. Excuse me, I'm not going to scratch that. Anyway, he wound up being one of the lead navigators for the 40th Combat Wing, which consisted of 3 groups, which was 108 airplanes, and he only flew when they were leading the wing, or leading the division, or leading the Air Force. And I don't think John ever flew more than about 16 or 17 missions because he was too valuable, you know. But anyway, and our first pilot I went overseas with did the same thing. But my job, I figured, well, here I'm going to get promoted, you know. And guess what? I was being Auburn educated, and exceptional, as the CO would say, you're either asleep or the coolest man alive, but he says, I'm going to give you a job, and your job is to take a crew that's making that first mission you sit in the right seat of that airplane and you check them out. So I spent something over about 20 missions flying with a first-time green crew, and I could always remember you could talk back and forth on the intercom. The gunners, you had to, because first place you had an oxygen check, every 45 seconds. The top turret gunner would just say oxygen check, and you just, some tail, waist, right waist, left ball,
Every 45 seconds?
Because if you waited a minute and a half, I'd be dead. We brought a dead man home from Liège, Belgium one time. They'd been bombing a hardened bridge and doing it the hard way. Mr. Calnus, what they call rape bombing, which is totally serious, but this was at Liège. This only mission I ever flew over Germany. The Germans had put the bridges, the Allies had broken out of the pocket, so to speak. They had captured most of France, but they were right on the border. But the Germans had a habit of these old-fashioned bridges. They'd pour 6 or 8 feet of reinforced concrete over the basic bridge, and they called it hardening, because those old European bridges, some of them were 500 or 600 years old, couldn't hold a Tiger tank, And our job, the medium bombers, couldn't carry, that 500-pound bomb was the biggest they could carry, and they were high explosives, and they would break up a lot of concrete, but they couldn't penetrate, and they used the heavy bombers to bomb with these, what we call bunker busters. They were 2,000-pound bombs that looked like an artillery shell. They pointed on the end. But they would penetrate up to 8 or 10 feet of concrete. But the sub-pins, which the 8th Air Force worked on for 2 solid years, they haven't breached the sub-pin wall yet, because they were 22 feet thick, the roof was, So even those sub-pins, they were designed to do that. They couldn't penetrate that much concrete. But the German subs had to get out of the North Atlantic into Brest and then Saint Nazaire. But anyway, we took a ball turret gunner home in the squadron. He was dead because his oxygen mask, he'd been spinning around, his oxygen had popped loose, and they found him, a couple of minutes, but he's dead as a doornail. That was a casualty, but it just proves that anti-aircraft fire was, sporadic and not very accurate. We call those milk runs, You get shot at, but you get missed further, That's a milk run. But anyhow, is there any questions? I say of my Air Force career, riding in the right seat, trying to tell a bunch of greenhorns, the first thing they'd tell you was, is that flak, Lieutenant? Sir, They called me Lieutenant Burhead, but they said Lieutenant Burhead, they'd say sir, They had to put sir on him.
Sure.
But they say, is that flak? I'll say, well, I'll let you know if the clouds have got rocks in them, that's flak,
Well, obviously the CO had a lot of faith in you to put you in charge of training those crews.
Well, no, now the pilot of a B-17 is the aircraft commander. He is responsible. Now that's why they used commissioned officers in the American Air Force, Air Corps, because you were responsible morally, physically, and I'll say financially, because you can't, B-17 at that time cost $250,000, but if you wrecked it, you were responsible for the damage, and you just didn't live it down, I'd put it that way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what was life like when you returned to the States? And then what did you do?
Well, I was a frustrated fighter pilot. I had volunteered when I was in Europe for the 7th Photo Reconnaissance Group, which job was to take pictures. They'd we'd go tear up a target, and the next day they were P-38s. They were funny-looking airplanes, had 2 tails and 2 engines, and a 54-foot wingspan. And they tried to use it. They were fighters, but they were so big that they couldn't get out of their own way. But they were excellent for photography work. But their only defense, they would take those fighter planes, take all the armaments, all the guns, self-sealing tanks, everything that was heavy, so they'd go faster, and then they would send them over Germany to take pictures by themselves. But the only defense they had was they had 2 engines. And they had changed out those Allison engines for the Rolls-Royce Merlin, which was a V12, but the Merlin was a marvelous engine. It powered the Spitfire for one, and the Mosquito bombers. The Packard made them in the United States under license, but the Merlin was only about 1,600 horsepower, but it was a marvelously efficient engine, and it had, and I may be wrong about this, but they had a particularly effective pressure carburation system, whereas the Germans had been using fuel injection for the whole of World War II. The Allies had finally gotten smart enough to have fuel injection after about 6 months of the war being over. Then fuel injection was all the difference in the world. I nearly had a crash in Atlanta, but I volunteered, showed up at the base. The CO sent me a letter of recommendation. I still got it. I thought I had it in the book. But unfortunately, the ME Messerschmitt 262 had just come under operations. That was a twin-engine jet German fighter plane, and that Messerschmitt 262 could go indicates about 700 miles an hour, and a P-51 a Mustang, straight and level, even with what we call a diving head start, could just barely make it to, say, 400. So when the Messerschmitt showed up, had to quit taking pictures, but because the Lightnings could take the picture, and then if they were intercepted by, say, a Messerschmitt, they had so much power they just started climbing, and they could climb to 40 or 50,000 feet and leave the Germans. They might be shooting at them, but they couldn't stay with them, you know. But the Messerschmitt could, so they started putting about 4 Mustangs for every reconnaissance plane. And the Mustangs, the idea was to be bait, to let the Messerschmitt shoot at them while the camera plane took the pictures, you know. And that was just anyway, I didn't ever later flew. I went to fighter transition after the war in Greenwood, Mississippi. Not after the war. The war was still on in Europe, but I went to fighter transition in the ATC. We learned how to fly Mustangs, the 51s, the Thunderbolts, the P-47s, the Lightnings, the old P-40 that had the shark's mouth on it.
P-40 Warhawk.
Yeah, which was the slowest, most ladylike airplane I ever flew in my life, kind of like riding in a car, but had the Russian plane they built for the Russians, a little P-63. It had an engine behind the pilot and had a 37 millimeter cannon that went through the nose. But the idea was we were going to be ferry pilots, so we'd pick up the airplanes at the factory. The P-47 factory was one of them was in Long Island, outside of New York City, Farmingdale, Long Island. They had a public factory at Evansville, Illinois, for example. And there's nothing as dangerous other than trying to drive a brand new automobile as driving an airplane that's just been built. You hasn't been test flown one time to fly around the pattern and land it. And it's up to the the delivery pilot to figure out if the carburetor works or the starter works or the, had to start because, but anyway, I ferried fighter planes for, almost a year. That's where I was, the war was over. In fact, the last day I was in fighter transition in Greenwood, Mississippi. We doing air work, just flying, and this happened to be I think probably a Mustang. A beautiful airplane to fly. The H model was very fast, and it had fuel injection. But we would do air work, which was just slow rolling and doing chandelles, the Immelman turns, which would turn and roll over. You could chandelle a 51 through 20,000 feet. You just had to run the engine wide open every 30 or 20 minutes to burn the 100 octane fuel, and some of it was 120 octane, had tetraethyl lead, and the lead would tend to foul the spark plugs, and the spark plugs fouled. You had two of them every cylinder, but a spark plug was fouled, it quit burning, so you'd run it wide open so it'd be hot enough to burn the lead off the spark plugs, and you just reminded because you'd start missing. You would, there's a particular vibration you felt. That was, but it came on the radio that all units in the air return to base and expedite. Well, expedite meant get your cute little fanny on the ground just as fast as you know how, and no excuses. Well, they didn't say the war was over, but this was a VJ day. And of course got on the ground, and the first thing you know, the line monkey, the guy that parked, put the chocks in the airplane, always, you see them in when you fly, this guy that has a flashlight that does this,
Sure.
If he does that, to keep your brakes off and keep coming right, if he does this, put your brakes on and cut your engine, But that's the same year round. But the war was over in Japan, and I was in Greenwood, Mississippi. Was going to celebrate the war and kiss all the pretty girls and drink champagne. And do you know what happened in Greenwood, Mississippi at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Went downtown with my best bib and tucker on. Even I had my ribbons, which was, incidentally, in World War II, it was very bad manners to wear more than a row of ribbons. Nowadays, you see a PFC with ribbons up on his, for drinking his milk every morning. But it was just bad manners. I don't care if you had a Congressional Medal of Honor.
So
you just had one row of ribbons.
Just one row, even if you had several, and you just didn't wear good taste, you wore one row.
We just
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Well, we weren't that conscious of being heroes. We were just glad to be alive,
Sure.
If you're in mortal combat, nothing makes any difference to feel your pulse, and you still got one, That's why I say I make a bad veteran. I'm the black sheep of American Legion post because I don't show up for meetings. But anyway, Greenwood, Mississippi on VJ Day, and this has something to tell you about the attitude in the Deep South. Everyone in the streets were deserted. There was no hugging, kissing, Dry County. Everyone was in church offering their prayers of thanksgiving that the war was over finally, and that the boys would be coming home, which is about 15 million of them. And I personally was, at that time I happened to be a Roman Catholic. I caught the same bus into town, back into my air base, because I don't know whether I'm sure they had a Catholic church, but I was in the mood to kiss a pretty girl and drink some champagne. You know, I walked through town, and on VJ Day, I sat on, there's a little, this colored section between going across town in Greenwood, a little town about the size of Fairhope, maybe. There was a little black boy, about 7 years old, eating a piece of watermelon, and he called me across this little fence. He said, I was walking down the sidewalk, he said, Mr. Soldier, said, the war is over, and come eat a piece of watermelon with me. And he called me Mr. Soldier. So I sat on the front steps of this black little shanty and ate a piece of hot green watermelon. And told him that when he got to be old, don't be in the army. You know, join the Navy. They ate better. We had powdered eggs. But anyhow, that's what I did, you know. And I had left the officers club, which they had, all the pretty girls had showed up at the officers club instead of church. All the champagne, moonshine. We had a fine, fine party, and it was properly celebrated, I think, as near as I remember. But that was my war career. Other than I had an engine failure over Atlanta, Georgia, and I was going to crash land the airplane in a railroad yard to keep from killing everybody, because it had 600 gallons of fuel aboard, and I was really pretty brave. But at the last minute, I pulled the throttle back just to, you know, and was going to turn off the switch, but when I pulled the throttle back, it caught the engine, caught just enough to be at about half power, and I was able to fly at about rooftops. But I flew across the railroad yard and over these little two-story buildings, and that side, the south side of Atlanta, goes downhill, and I found a gully, and that plane did not have enough power to climb, but as I burned off every gallon of gas, that was 7 pounds, 6.8 pounds to the gallon, 100 octane gas, I got to Griffin, Georgia at about 100 feet of altitude, and I called the tower, and the tower had been talking to me because they said, you're on fire because it's like an engine that floods these pressure carburetors. It was just burned 100 gallons an hour, and it wasn't making any power. It was just burning this all black oily smoke. And I didn't have time to talk to the tower. I didn't have time to do anything except try to get that plane as a fighter plane away, go like the devil, but it flew like a brick when it had all 2,000 horsepower. Anyway, I burned enough gas. I had about 100 feet, and I called. It was Hartsville Field. I said, I've got an emergency. I said, I've got to clear the runway. I said, I don't know how much longer I can keep it in the air. And the tower says, wait a minute, and about 30 seconds, the Air Materiel Command of 6 or 7 said, your orders are as follows: crash the airplane, put wheels up in any cornfield you want, or land at any airport, but don't bring it back to Hartsville Field, because we don't need a wreck in a busy plane. I'm serious. Now, do you know I wound up flying at half, all the way to Memphis, Tennessee, which is where I was supposed to take it in the first place, and I finally got to 500 feet. It never did move the throttle. I was afraid to. What does it burn off the fuel? It just get lighter and lighter, and I'd get another couple of feet.
Altitude.
You know. But that was all. But the guy on the tower and the mayor of Atlanta, he said, we want the pilot's name because he should be recognized, you know. Well, same deal. Ribbons, awards, medals. I was fed up. I had just as much, I had been flying these worn out wrecks, you know. They'd weld the wheels down on them because they didn't want to repair the landing gear, because they were going to junk them, you know.
Oh.
And we'd fly around with the wheels down, welded, and no flight instruments, nothing. But I was just fed up. And you fly under, I got a copy of restricted orders, and the tower cannot release the name of a service pilot without his express written permission or his commanding officers. And he had called the 777th Ferry Squadron in Romulus, Michigan to tell me what was the name of that pilot on such and such a number of airplane. And the CO says, look, he'll tell you himself if he wants to, but if he doesn't tell you, I'm not going to tell you, and I'll tell you I ain't going to tell you, because I figured I was going to be in more trouble with the mayor of Atlanta, with the politics and all that. And as I say, I probably would have got another cluster on my air medal. But I didn't think of myself as being heroic. I thought of myself as crashing that airplane with a bomb right in the south side of that's the only thought I had, I just got to keep this thing off the ground. I didn't think about me being with it, about being in there. I just thought I got to keep it off the ground. And I think it was just willpower that did it. Because everything else that passes for heroism is self-preservation. I mean, by and large, you bring a B-17 back because you got a date that night, or you want to eat supper, or you don't eat supper, but they serves you 2 ounces of whiskey every mission. But you get your whiskey ration. But heroism is self-preservation, and nothing like it. Bill Lawley, that's got a bridge named after him in Montgomery, was badly wounded. His co-pilot's head was blown off. He flew for 4 hours, just bleeding to death. He lived because he had 2 crewmen that were too badly wounded to bail out, and he flew them back to England. And most of the bombardier was just a washed-out pilot, and he knew enough how to fly, how to keep a plane in the air. And Bill, they got him conscious enough to land it. Now, Bill got a Congressional Medal of Honor. He was in the 365th Bomb Squadron, and I was in the 366th. Now, I didn't know Bill. Now, he did this in March of '44, and I didn't get there till July of '44. But Bill flew maybe 15 missions, but they sent him home, and he was a hero, and he really was. And that was not uncommon, but he was still thinking of those 2 guys. I talked to Bill a long time in Salt Lake, and he thought about those 2 guys that were, if he bailed out, and he wore the harness, but had 2 big D-rings, and you put your parachute under the seat, and you picked the parachute up, and you clipped it on your chest, and then you bailed out through the bomb bay if it's open, or you had a little hatch under the nose behind the propellers. Bad manners to bail out looking at with the propellers behind you. But there's cases where guys would get so excited they'd reach to pull the ripcord and realize they'd forgotten the parachute. Right? That's 5 miles to fall, and think about next time I'm going to put my parachute on. But anyhow, that's self-preservation. But Bill was thinking about those 2 guys in the back of the airplane,
Brothers taking care of brothers.
But now he got a Congressional Medal, and should have, and did, because he had to really be just resuscitated to be conscious long enough to even land the airplane, And his co-pilot didn't even have a head. I mean, a 20 millimeter had hit him right in the they had him laid out somewhere, and there wasn't much room on those things.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of people that you admire, you know.
Oh, without question.
But it's, but for the grace of God go I, and I don't need any medals, and I don't need VFW meetings or anything else. The VFW is bad about drinking beer. I don't approve at all. But I'm taking too much. I could go on for hours and hours.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, you've had a great adventure and a great life, and we've certainly enjoyed it today, Charlie. And we want to thank you for the great service you've done for this country and continue to do.
Well, nothing to thank me for. I made it. You know, I don't need any better benefits. I made it alive, and if I died on the way home, I wouldn't have it any other way.